Welcome to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 will take a look at the concept of motivating employees. People in a company can be the most important resource. However, they can also be the most challenging resource to manage as well. Employees who are motivated and work hard can become an important competitive advantage for a company. So we'll take a look at how management goes about motivating employees in this chapter. So if we take a look at our puzzle of all the components of management and operating a successful business, motivation really falls into the leadership function of management. We've talked about planning, we've talked about organizing, so this is part of the leading or motivating component. And it's one of the four key functions of management, as you will recall. Chapter, we'll take a look at some of the basic principles of motivation and how they developed. We'll take a look at the scientific management approach. We'll take a look at the Hawthorne studies. We'll talk a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy and the ERG theory. We'll also take a look at the theory X, theory Y, Oochie's theory Z, which are theories that are attempt to explain worker motivation. Then we'll take a look at some more of the contemporary theories of motivation and ways that managers can redesign existing jobs to increase motivation and performance in employees. And then, of course, we'll take a look at some of the challenges facing organizations today with respect to motivating and retaining employees. So what is motivation? In short, motivation is a person's internal drive to act. And it's really something that prompts a person to release energy or focus their skill sets and energies in a certain direction. One of the most challenging skills of a manager really is the ability to induce motivation in employees so that they'll be committed and productive and assist the organization in meeting its goals. So while motivation is an internal force, there are ways that managers can use to stimulate workers that bring out their natural drive to do a good job. Motivation is kind of a need and want satisfying process. So a need is best defined as the gap between what is today and what is required. And a want is a gap between what is and what is desired. So unsatisfied needs and wants create a state of tension in an individual, and it pushes or motivates them to practice behaviors that'll result in that need being met or fulfilled. So in essence, motivation is what pushes us to move from where we are to where we want to be. In motivation, it's important to understand the different types of rewards that will motivate employees. There are intrinsic rewards and extrinsic rewards. Intrinsic rewards really is the good feeling you have when you've done a job well. Such things as satisfaction, contentment, sense of accomplishment, confidence, or pride in one's work. So these are factors that can motivate employees. Extrinsic rewards are something given to you by someone else's recognition for good work. And that might be a pay raise, it might be promotion. These are really external to the job, but are valued by the employee. So it's important to note that for the rewards to be a motivating factor, they must be valued by the individual. Research has shown that happy employees lead to happy customers, which leads to improved financial performance for an organization. The cost of an organization of having unhappy workers is very high. So according to some research, it can be as low as the cost of losing a good employee can be as low as 25% of their salary to as high as 200% of their employee. There's such thing as direct costs, the time it takes to hire an employee, um, interviewing, moving costs, onboarding, training, equipment, and that sort of thing, and as well as some of the soft costs of losing a valued employee can be even greater. Their intellectual capital, the decreased morale in the organization, increased stress by employees, and negative reputation, and that sort of thing. So it's important for management to be able to motivate employees so that they are satisfied in the workplace today. Frederick Taylor is known as the father of scientific management, and is one of the first individuals who studied the concept of motivation and trying to find ways to get employees to become more efficient. Frederick Taylor was an American efficiency engineer in the early 1900s, and he worked at a steel mill, a steel factory. And he found himself frustrated at the lack of efficiency of the laborers working in the mills. So he started to believe that there was ways to improve the efficiency and the way that workers did their jobs. So he really studied the individual jobs in the mill and redesigned the equipment and methods used by the workers. For instance, he would monitor the movements of those individuals whose job it was to shovel coal into the blast furnaces. So he would study their motions. He would use a stopwatch to record the motions. He would look at the equipment, the shovels that they would use, and he would try different shovels, try different movements, trying to do a study to find the best one best way to do that job. In essence, he broke down those tasks into individual, very specific movements to find the most effective and efficient way to do it. He would then create an instruction sheet and then train individuals on telling them exactly how long or how to do a specific job and how long it should take. And his studies did lead to huge increases in productivities in the steel mills. And this was about the early 1900s. And his research was published in a book in 1911 called The Principles of Scientific Management. And these principles really became used and are still used by many organizations today. The principles outlined in his research were centered around four things. First of all was developing a scientific approach for each element of a person's job to find the best tools, the best equipment, the best methods, the best movements, the best ways to do a job. And then he would scientifically select, train, and develop the workers so that they understand exactly how that job is done. His research did encourage cooperation between the workers and the management so that each job can be accomplished in that standard scientifically determined way. And he determined that the last step was to divide work and responsibility to who is better suited to that task. Make sure that individuals, you had the right individuals doing the right jobs. So his research was really pioneering when he published his studies and on production efficiency. And it really contributed to the concepts of specialization of labor that we see today. It contributed or developed the time and motion studies that many organizations use today. Today, many companies use some of his principles. For instance, McDonald's has a scientific way, an approach how to cook their burgers and put them together. Call centers, use scientific management principles to measure how many calls per hour and the right way to do it. UPS uses these principles by and broken down components into job, on how fast employees should be to work or walk rather, um, and using scanners to measure the time from one stage to another, etc. So his work became an important foundation for the concept of ways to motivate employees. In many factory settings today, we see the concept of piece rate pay. So employees get paid for the amount of output that they do, which is an outcome from Frederick Taylor's scientific management theory. So the principles that Frederick Taylor developed in the scientific management approach became popular with management from the 1900s to the 1930s. And this really became known as the classical era of management, which really focused on the personal economic needs of employees and the ability of management to focus on that to increase motivation. One of the proponents of scientific management was another engineer by the name of Elton Mayo. And Elton Mayo conducted some studies at Western Electric Company's Hawthorne plant in Illinois from 1927 to 1933. He believed that by controlling some of the environmental the environment that employees worked in would also have an effect on motivation. So he split the company into two groups, one being a control group that didn't receive the focus of different environmental variables, and the experimental group, which he focused on changing some environmental variables and his belief was that the experimental group would see improved productivity compared to the control group. So one of the first things he did was to study the effects of lighting. He believed that by creating a better lighting in the work plant would lead to higher levels of productivity in the experimental group, but he wouldn't see the same productivity improvement in the control group. He also then went on to study other environmental variables such as humidity, temperature, in the plant, with the same belief that the experimental group would see improved productivity. His studies led to some important findings. What he in fact found was that productivity improved in both groups, which really perplexed him because scientific management principles would suggest the opposite. So he really came to three primary conclusions about worker motivation. First thing, he found that people felt special and worked hard to stay in the experimental group, and this really motivated them. It wasn't the environmental variable that was increasing productivity. It was the feeling that employees got as being special because they got to participate in this study. He also found that workers involved in planning the experiments and felt that their ideas were respected and management listened to them, and this also motivated them. And he found that no matter what the physical environment was, it was the atmosphere in the entire plant, both in the control group and the experimental group, became positive. The employees liked the increased pay for increased productivity, which motivated them, but they also liked being focused on. So this really encouraged researchers to study human motivation and managerial styles that led to more productivity. And the Hawthorne effect really refers to the tendency for people to behave differently when they know they're being studied. So the Hawthorne effect prompted a shift away from scientific management to the Hawthorne study's new human based management, and this became known as the human resources era of management, which really emphasized the fact that in addition to personal economic needs that were emphasized in the classical era of management under Fred Taylor's approach, that social needs really played an important part in influencing behaviors of employees. So this was a radical change in management's thinking that by including employees in the planning processes, by having them engaged and feel special and that their opinions mattered, actually could lead to increased motivation. So a big turnaround in terms of motivation management happening in the after the 1930s, after the conclusion of the classical era of management. So an important contribution to management studies that are in place even today. So Elton Mayo's findings in the Hawthorne experiments led to some new assumptions about employees. And one of those was that pay was not the only motivator and was sometimes found to be a relatively ineffective motivator. And this really led to more studies on the human and psychological element of workers in the human resource era of management. One a noted psychologist by the name of Abraham Maslow did one such study on the human and psychological elements of workers and motivation. And Maslow believed that motivation actually arises from unmet needs, and that an individual, a worker, is motivated to satisfy unmet needs, and that you could not motivate an employee or a worker using methods that focused on needs that were already being met. He also believed that there were 5 levels of needs, and there was a very defined hierarchy of needs in workers. So let's take a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the first and most basic level of the needs pyramid was physiological needs. And physiological needs really are the needs for food and shelter. And that employees that did not have those needs met would be more motivated by those physiological needs. For instance, people who did not have enough money to live on would certainly be motivated by and work hard to be able to satisfy their financial needs for the need for shelter and food. So that would be their primary motivation. However, once those needs were being met, those needs no longer became motivators because they were already met, and employees would look to something else to motivate them. And so the next level in the hierarchy was safety. So safety really is the need to feel secure, both at work and at home. So to be protected from physical harm, perhaps to be protected from hazards in the workplace. So both the physiological and the safety needs really are more physical types of needs that individuals had. Once both the physiological and safety needs were being met, employees and workers would look towards something else that would motivate them, because those met needs were no longer motivating them. So the next and third level in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is social needs. And social needs really are the needs to feel loved or accepted or part of the group, whether at work or whether at home. So according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once the physical needs were being met, things that would motivate employees would be things like informal social groups, both on and off the job, to help them to satisfy these needs at work or at home. Um, Once those needs were being met, the fourth need in the hierarchy was esteem needs, and this is self-esteem, the need for recognition, the need for acknowledgement, perhaps the need for status in an organization. So this included things like praise, recognition from managers, really contributed to the sense of self-work and would be motivating to employees to met these needs once their first, second, and third level hierarchy needs were being met. The highest level of needs was something that was called self-actualization. And this is really the need to accomplish established goals and to develop oneself. And this is kind of the concept of being all you can be. So it's that inner drive to motivation to do everything the best that they can be, to live up to one's full potential and full abilities. And many mid and upper level managers who've really satisfied all the lower needs are really driven by that personal self-actualization goals. So if you take a look at like somebody like Stephen Jobs, who I'm sure has all the physical need or had all the physiological needs met, safety needs. I'm sure he felt safe and secure, and he had lots of friends, so he was meeting his social needs, and certainly developed a very high sense of self-esteem. So what motivated him was the self-actualization need to be everything that he could be, and that's what drove him. So the whole concept is in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is once a need is satisfied, it can no longer be a motivating factor, and once a need was met, a higher level need emerges. So from a management perspective, it really meant that managers needed to understand the need level of employees and design, programs to trigger self-motivation by focusing on the unmet needs. Maslow's theory does have some claim or some validity. However, it certainly isn't without, criticism. He suggested that a higher level need really wasn't activated until a lower level need was met, and that a satisfied need wasn't a motivator. However, some research has not really verified those principles in any strict sense. His theory was also said that you moved upwards in the pyramid, you couldn't move down in the pyramid, and it doesn't really distinguish, between differences among cultures and that sort of thing. So some cultures might put social needs before everything else, that's the most important motivating factor. So, So it has been, his theory has been criticized and has led to some other studies in management or treating employees to look for other ways to manage or motivate employees. Because of some of the shortcomings in Maslow's theory, Clayton Alderfer developed the ERG theory to try to better understand employee motivation. So he designed a system that had three components and three needs that were existence needs, relatedness needs, and growth needs. So the existence needs really are similar to Maslow's physiological and safety needs. The relatedness needs are really similar to the social and external esteem needs in Maslow's theory. And the growth stage is really comparable to Maslow's self actualization and internal self esteem needs. So the differences in the Maslow and ERG theory are that the ERG theory really recognizes that there can be an overlap of needs. Maslow suggested one need had to be met before satisfying the next or looking for the next needs level of needs. But the ERG theory really recognizes that can be an overlap of needs. And Maslow really allowed that only one need really was pursued at a time. However, the ERG theory allows that different levels can be pursued and act as motivators at the same time. And so the ERG theory really accounts for differences in cultures better, and also recognizes that there are different need orders for different people. While Maslow assumed that people will stay at one level and then move on to the next, which was really, looking to based on the premise that unmet needs were not motivators under Maslow's theory. The ERG theory acknowledges that if a higher order need is not met and the person becomes frustrated, they will want to increase satisfaction by moving to a lower level need. This is what he called the frustration regression model. So if some needs weren't better met, they would increase satisfaction by looking to go back to some of the lower based needs. So it was very interactive, and it wasn't as defined as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Douglas McGregor was one of Maslow's students, and he influenced the study of motivation by looking at two contrasting sets of assumptions about human nature. And these he termed Theory X and Theory Y. And he believed that management styles either followed a Theory X belief or assumptions about human nature, or a Theory Y based assumptions about human nature. So the Theory X management style was really based more on a pessimistic view of human nature. And it assumed things like that the average person dislikes work and they'll avoid it at all costs, or if possible, that people don't like to work. They must be controlled, directed, and threatened with punishment to make an effort in their work. Theory X also believed that the average person prefers to be directed. People avoided responsibility. They didn't like taking on accountability, and that people or workers lacked in motivation. They wanted security above all else. So this view of people suggests that managers must continually prod or threaten employees to perform, and most must control their behaviors while they're working in the workplace. So Theory X managers tell people what to do. They're very directive. They like to be into control, and they don't have a lot of confidence in employees. And Theory X managers also create an atmosphere of having very dependent, passive, almost resentful employees in the workplace. McGregor also had a contrasting view of management that he termed Theory Y, and it was really based on a more optimistic view of human nature. And it assumed things that work was natural. People want to work. They want to be self-directed. They want to be self-controlled. They want some element of self-control, and they want to achieve the goals of the organization as long as they believed in them. Theory Y believes that workers can be motivated by using positive incentives and positive reinforcement, and that employees will accomplish goals if they believe they will be rewarded for doing so. And he also believed, under the Theory Y view of management, and employee behavior was that under proper conditions, the average employee not only accepts responsibility but will seek it out. The belief that employees, are creative, they want to do well, they want to do the right thing. So managers who operate on theory Y assumptions recognize that there are individual differences and really encourage workers to learn and develop their skills. So by a theory Y worker might encourage some, clerical staff to prepare reports and do things that perhaps is out of their normal job scope, and then provide them with some sort of recognition and reward for doing so, and that things like that would certainly motivate employees. Research has shown that taking a theory Y approach to management can create a corporate culture that has happier workers, lower turnover rates, and becomes a company where employees are happy and employees want to work for. So the success of the theory Y approach to management has been demonstrated as being positive. William Oochie was a scholar at the University of California in Los Angeles, and he studied both North American and Japanese business practices, and took a look at the ways that managers in North America operated and managers under the Japanese style of management operated, and really looked towards defining the things that would motivate employees by taking the best of both management practices. For instance, under the North American management style, length of employment is typically shorter term, and workers were subject to layoff if business declines, whereas in Japanese style of management, really focused on lifetime employment, and really layoffs were not used to reduce costs. So under theory Z, which is a combination of the North American and the Japanese management approach, suggested that long-term, but not necessarily lifetime, employment was a better motivator to create stable, loyal workforce in the business environment. He also took a look at the rate of progression in a company. And in the North American style of management, there's relatively rapid progression through a company, whereas in the Japanese style of management, it's relatively slow progression up the management scale. And so he studied, and the best approach was slow career development to ensure that managers were thoroughly trained at each level before being promoted to upper levels of management, and that was more effective at creating a successful organization. He also took a look at the concept of specialization, and in the North American style there was a lot of specialization where workers became experts in a single functional area, whereas under the Japanese style of management there was minimal specialization, and workers really became experts in the organization rather than in a specific function. And he suggested that the best approach was moderate specialization. So having specialists understand, key components of the job, but also to focus on the overall organization as well, to have a good sense of what's good for the company rather than what's good just for a specific area. So a combination of Japanese and traditional North American management styles. Decision making in the traditional North American style typically is individual based versus a group based management decision making style in Japanese management. And so based on Oochie's study, the most effective was group decision making for better decisions, and which also made it easier to implement in an organization. He took a look at the concept of responsibility for success or failure, whereas in the North American business model, it's really assigned to an individual. We monitor individual performance, whereas in the Japanese style, focused on group, and responsibility for success or failure was shared by a group, and believed that the best was to focus on responsibility, or giving responsibility for success or failure to an individual to avoid that was most effective and in motivating employees. He also took a look at the control by the manager. In the North American style, it's very explicit, very formal, whereas in Japanese management style, more of an informal management approach. And based on his studies, that the most effective was a more informal control by manager, but still with some very clear, defined performance measures that individuals would take responsibility for. He also took a look at the amount of concern or compassion for workers. In the traditional North American style, it really focuses on work-related aspects. The auto work or the personal life really wasn't a focus of management, whereas under the Japanese style, it really focuses on concern for the whole balanced life of workers. And based on his studies, the most effective management theory or management style is showing concern based on the worker's whole life, and including their family life. So we've seen in the last decade that the Japanese management philosophy, which really centered on the employee and group work and long-term relationships, really has declined, and there's the profitability of Japanese companies, based on the TSE, has also declined, and some of that is probably attributed to some of the Japanese management philosophies that perhaps are no longer as appropriate. And so some major Japanese companies such as Sony and Hitachi are moving away from that lifetime employment and really focuses on profitability, management accountability, to be competitive in the global business market today. So some interesting studies done on the North American and Japanese styles under Oochie's theory Z, that can provide some guidance on things to focus on or emphasize in managing our employees. Another important contribution to our understanding of individual motivation came from Fred Hertzberg's studies. And he was a psychologist in the late 50s and early 60s, which took a look at all of the factors that were controllable by managers to really determine what are the most effective at generating motivated employees. So he took a look at what people really wanted from their work experience. And he surveyed many employees to find out what work elements made them feel good or bad about their jobs. And based on his research, he termed two types of motivating factors that led to or could affect motivation. The first group are what he called motivating factors, and these were things that led to job satisfaction. So motivating factors are job factors that cause employees to be productive and gave them satisfaction. So some of those things might be recognition for a job well done, given responsibility, advancement, growth within the company or the organization, feeling good for achieving goals or achieving a level of performance in the organization. And these were primarily intrinsic job elements that led to motivation. He also termed something that he called hygiene factors. And these were not things that he termed as job dissatisfiers. So these were things that would not necessarily create satisfaction in employees, but if not present, would lead to job dissatisfaction. So these were more extrinsic elements of the work environment and included things like good company policy, supervision, the conditions that employees were working within, health or safety wise, interpersonal relationships at work, pay, benefits, salary, and job security. So, one of the most interesting results of his studies was the implication that the opposite of satisfaction is not dissatisfaction. So he believed that proper management of hygiene factors could prevent employee dissatisfaction, but these could not be used to create satisfaction or job motivation. For instance, good working conditions will keep employees at a job and won't make them work any harder. Pay for many, or once they've achieved a certain level, of course, could not be a motivator under Hertzberg's theory, but the absence of fair pay and salary and benefits could be a dissatisfactor. But giving by increasing pay, increasing benefits, would not necessarily drive motivation for a long period of time. So according to Hertzberg, a manager wants to increase employee satisfaction, really need to focus on those satisfier or the motivating factors. And a job with many satisfactors will usually motivate employees. So to focus on providing prompt, effective performance evaluations, providing good feedback on work that is done, providing opportunities for advancement and training, and allowing them opportunities to grow within the organization and self-develop within the organization. So those were the things that managers should focus on to influence behavior in an organization. So, in conclusion, Hertzberg's theory suggests that the best way to motivate employees is to make the job interesting, help employees to achieve their objectives, and recognize them through advancement and added responsibility. So sometimes the best motivator is a simple and sincere thanks. I appreciate what you're doing, as opposed to a focus on some of those extrinsic elements of the work environment, which really don't create motivation. So many companies today will focus on those motivating factors, rewards, recognition programs, celebrating successes as a group or an individual, focusing on promoting the best of the best within organizations as a means to motivate employees in companies today. So the early management scholars that we've talked about really laid a foundation that enabled managers to understand their workers better and how best to motivate them. But since then, some new theories have given us, even a more deep understanding of worker motivation in the workplace today. So we'll take a look at three of those theories. The first being the expectancy theory. We'll talk a little bit about the equity theory. And lastly, we'll talk about goal setting theory in the following slides. So one of the best supported and widely accepted theories of motivation is Victor Vroom's expectancy theory. And it focuses on the link between motivation and behavior. According to the expectancy theory, the probability that an individual will act in a particular way will depend on how strongly the person believes that their behavior will have a particular outcome and whether they value that outcome. So the Victor Vroom suggests that employees ask themselves three questions before committing maximum effort to do a task. They will take a look at and ask themselves whether they can accomplish that task. If the answer is no, they certainly won't be motivated. If it is yes, they feel that the task is within their ability to complete, then they will take a look at the outcome or ask themselves, if I do accomplish it, what is my reward? Is that reward worth my effort? If the answer is no, they will certainly not be motivated. But if the answer is yes, the reward is worth it, they will in fact be motivated. So, so it really says that individuals' expectations can affect their level of motivation. So according to the expectancy theory, managers should do the following to motivate their employees. The first thing is managers should determine the rewards that are valued by the employee. Having a key understanding of what rewards are evaluated is essential to motivating employees. The next step is determine the desired performance level or standards, and then making sure that it's clearly understood to our employees. Third, make sure that the performance level is attainable, that it is reachable, it is doable by the employee. And next, to link rewards to the achievement of those performance objectives. So guaranteeing that the rewards are tied to their performance. And making sure that the rewards are in fact adequate for the level of performance. So as a student, you might take a look at, you ask yourselves, to get an A plus in the course, you have to get a mark of, over 90%. So you might ask yourself three questions. A, can I do it? What's the grade? The second question you might ask yourself, if I can do it, what's the grade worth? What will it do for me? If it's not going to do anything, you're not going to be motivated to work hard to get an A plus in the course. And but if you can do it, is getting an A plus in the course worth the effort that you put into it? If it's not, you certainly will not be motivated to work hard to get an A plus in this course. So in short, the expectancy theory holds that the probability of an individual acting in one way or a particular way depends on how strongly they believe that this act or this behavior will have a particular outcome and whether they value that outcome. So it has some good implications for what managers should do in trying to motivate their employees today. So again, just a summary of the expectancy theory and how management can motivate employees, determine the rewards valued by the employees, determine the desired performance levels of individual employees, and making sure that those performance levels are attainable and clearly communicated to employees, and then make sure that we link the rewards to the performance. Important to understand what factors might counteract the effectiveness of a reward, and making sure the reward is adequate for the level of performance and desirable to our employees. Another contemporary management theory is something that's called the equity theory, and it's really the idea that employees try to maintain equity between the inputs and outputs compared to others in similar positions. And it deals with the question, if I do a good job, will it be worth it? Employees will evaluate their outcomes in relation to their inputs and compare it to perhaps previous experience that they've had in a different position within the same organization, or perhaps their experiences in other organizations, and or compare it to other employees within the company. And it really focuses on the concept of equity. It's really the perception of fairness, and sometimes the perception of fairness can be in error. So it's important to make sure that we have clear and frequent communication with all employees in the organization. So on the next slide, if an employee perceives that they are not equal or not being treated fairly, they will act in one or more different ways. So we'll take a look at that on the next slide. So, under the equity theory, if there's a perception of inequity based on comparison to other positions in other companies or comparing themselves to other employees, if they perceive they are not being treated fairly, that there is some sort of inequity, that will change. That will affect employee behaviors. For instance, if there's inequity, they may change their work habits. They may change their job benefits and income. They may change or distort their perceptions of themselves or distort their perceptions of others. Sometimes they may decide to leave the organization. So the behavior will attempt to rebalance the inequity. So perhaps they will reduce their effort in the future to try and minimize that inequity that they see, or they will adopt an attitude of who cares, and not be motivated to work hard. Perhaps they'll call in sick if they see perception of inequity. To avoid the perception of inequity, it's important for managers to have very clear communications, and when rewarding employees, making sure that we explain why employees are being rewarded for what they do. So tie the behavior of the employee to the reward, so that everybody understands what the employee is being rewarded for, what the particular behaviors are, to reduce the perception of inequity. So this theory has some real life implications. I've had some workers who perceive inequity in the salary that they're earning compared to what they perceive to be the salary of other employees. And so their behaviors perhaps are to work to the letter of the law because they believe they are being treated unfairly. And sometimes it's very difficult to manage because there's a lot of confidential information. So the best thing to do for managers is to be clearer and tying behaviors to rewards so that everybody understands it, not just the person that's being rewarded, that everybody understands, to prevent the perception of inequity in the organization. Another popular theory is something that's termed the goal-setting theory. And it's the idea that setting ambitious but attainable goals can motivate workers and improve performance if the goals are accepted and accompanied by feedback within the organization. So it's important that goals have to be accepted by employees, and they have to be given feedback on their performance in how well they're achieving those particular goals. So really three components of that. First is setting goals that are very clear and very specific, and by doing that and making sure that the employees buy into those goals will lead to a higher level of performance. And the concept that those goals have to be very clear. They have to be very specific, They have to be very measurable, attainable, relevant to the organization's objectives, and have a time-based element. So SMART, or SMART goals, can be more effective than goals that are less clear. Goals such as do your best are not very effective goals. Making sure that the goals are not easy, that they are challenging. So more difficult goals can lead to better performance than easy goals, provided though that the employee does accept the goal. And the third component is monitoring and providing feedback on the progress towards achieving those goals, and of course rewarding behavior. The goal setting theory really became popular in the 1960s by Peter Drucker in his Management by Objectives, or MBO, which really was a system of goal setting and implementation that really involved a cycle of discussion, review, and evaluation of those objectives with employees, amongst top and middle level managers, as well as supervisors and front level workers, and really is the premise that managers must take on more of a coaching role, that managers cannot create motivation, but really can create an environment for the seed of motivation to grow. And goal setting theory, or management by objectives, helps employees to motivate themselves. Really important to remember that employee involvement and commitment to those goals is very important in management by objectives. So many organizations use a form of goal setting theory today to help employees motivate themselves to meet their goals and be rewarded and recognized for that. The theories that we've looked at so far really have set forth a contribution to our current understanding of employee motivation. So we want to take a little bit of a look at some more practical matters to way to use some of those concepts to motivate employees. And one of those things is the reinforcement theory. And reinforcement theory is really the application of consequences in response to behavior. And many of you will have studied B.F. Skinner's operant learning theory, and which really is the premise behind reinforcement theory, and suggests that consequences influence behaviors. And by having positive and negative reinforcers can motivate an employee to behave in certain ways. So, for instance, to increase or maintain a certain behavior, a manager might want to introduce consequences, such as positive reinforcement. So if you've got an employee that's always meeting their goals and doing a great job, reinforcing that behavior by providing positive reinforcement and recognizing them at team meetings, or recognizing them with a pay raise or a promotion and that sort of thing. Also, on the other hand, to increase or maintain behavior, we might remove consequences. For instance, which is called negative reinforcement. For instance, if you've got an employee, they have been making lots of errors, so you may have introduced some remedial steps that they need to take. And once they have met the performance standard, you take away the extra work that they have. I had one employee whose credit quality was less than acceptable, so I introduced, for every application they did, some checklists that they had to go through and check off to make sure that they've covered all of certain key components of a credit application. And once they were brought their work up to standard, I took away that extra work, that extra checklist that they had to do. So I removed some of the consequences, and that allowed them or motivated them to maintain that level of performance because they didn't have to do the extra work. Sometimes, um, uh, if you wanted to decrease or remove a behavior, um, you may use something that's called punishment. And that might be reduced words, layoffs, or firing in the extreme the extreme case to discourage a behavior, or using something that's called extinction, and um, that means ignoring the behavior. Don't respond to it at all in an attempt to get the employee to change their behavior. So if you have an employee, for example, who's they're meeting their targets, give them a bonus or positive reinforcement. But when the employee no longer meets those targets, you remove the bonus. So that would be an example of extinction. If you have other employees who aren't meeting their targets, you give them warnings whenever they don't meet their targets, which would be punishment. But when they do meet their targets, you no longer give those punishments or negative reinforcers. So the reinforcement theory suggests that there is a focus on consequences, and by introducing or removing consequences, managers can really encourage the right behaviors or discourage the wrong behaviors. Many of these concepts of reinforcement theory are used outside of management, but certainly does have some implications for management. I read a book once called Whale Done, and Whale Done is a management theory book based on reinforcement behavior or reinforcement theory, but it focuses on the training of killer whales and how to get killer whales to jump out of the pool in an aquarium. And so the first thing that the trainers did was laid a rope across the bottom of the pool, and every time that the killer whale would swim over the rope, they would provide some positive reinforcement. They would give them a fish or whatever. Next step was to move the rope to the middle of the pool. So the killer whale had the option of swimming under the rope, and if they swam under the rope, they would not provide any reward. They would ignore it to try and extinguish that behavior. But when the killer whale would swim over the rope, again, they would provide positive reinforcement by giving them a fish. So the next step was to raise the rope to the surface level of the water in the pool, and so to get that positive reinforcement, the killer whale would have to jump over the rope. So some of the key things to learn was that by providing positive reinforcement could motivate the killer whale, just like in a workplace, by providing positive reinforcement can motivate employees to behave in one way versus another. In the killer whale example, punishment was generally not used except in extreme circumstances. Who wants to get into a pool and start punishing a killer whale? Not me. And it's not very effective. And management studies suggest that punishment and public reprimand really except in very extreme circumstances when we need to lead to termination of employees, may not be the most effective reinforcement. And certainly the concept of removing consequences, not rewarding behaviors when the incorrect behavior, or not taking away rewards when behaviors are not being met, can also encourage the killer whale to do the right thing and our workers to do the right thing. So some interesting ways to use reinforcement theory in the business world and other areas today. Managers today might look at redesigning or modifying jobs in a way to increase motivation and performance in the workplace today. There's really three main options that have been used extensively in the workplace today to increase motivation to employees. The first is job enlargement, and that is really expanding the scope of a job. So increase the number and the variety of tasks that a person will perform. It's by increasing the task diversity can enhance job satisfaction, particularly when the job is really mundane and repetitive in nature. So sometimes we may have factory workers, and if they're doing the same type of job day in, day out, they become very bored. And so by giving them added responsibilities, increasing the scope of their job, can provide job satisfaction in itself. And one of the concerns when trying to motivate through job enlargement is that sometimes employees might be perceived as being asked to work harder and do more with no change in their compensation. So that can cause resentment and lead to dissatisfaction. So it's really important to communicate why you're expanding the scope of an employee's job so that it actually acts as a motivational factor. Another way to attempt to motivate employees is through job enrichment, and that's the vertical expansion of the employee's job. So, job enlargement increases the scope, and enrichment increases the job depth, perhaps by giving the employee more decision-making power, more autonomy, more responsibility, and so job enrichment can increase the employee's level of satisfaction. They have more control over their work, their planning of their work, and learn some new skills along the way. So it's been found to enrich jobs can have an increase in job satisfaction and reduce absenteeism or reduce turnover in an organization as well. Another way to motivate employees might be through job rotation. Uh, and sometimes in today's environment we call this cross training. So shifting workers from one job to another, and so it allows employees to gain some additional skills, broaden their skill base, and increase the challenging nature of the work that they're doing, and so employees, the organization will benefit from job rotation because it increases the flexibility and the skill set of our employees, but it also can lead to employees not being as bored in their job. So moving employees from one job to another can lead to the achievement of organizational goals and motivate employees. Some other things that are being used to motivate employees today are things like a compressed work week, um, recognizing that employees value their leisure time. So, having many organizations have a shorter work week to allow employees more family time when it's valued by employees. Perhaps some flex time arrangements, giving employees the autonomy to decide what their hours will be as long as it meets the needs of the organization, can be a motivating tool to use. Job sharing, to share jobs with another employees. Perhaps employees don't want to work full time. They will share a job with another employee. Can be an effective way of motivating employees, or allowing employees to work from home. Can keep and retain employees, and perhaps increase their their satisfaction in working for a company. So these are some of the more common benefits that are being offered to employees today to both motivate and retain workers in the workplace. In the work. All employees have unique needs that they seek to fulfill through their jobs in the workplace today. And organizations must devise a wide variety of incentives to ensure that their needs can be addressed in the workplace. And we'd certainly be remiss at not looking at the different incentives that businesses can provide to incent employees to behave in one way, shape, or another. Uh, Today's business environment, there's a wider range of monetary incentives to reward employees. Um, Things like stock option plans, bonuses, profit sharing plans, um, or piece rate plans are ways to provide a monetary incentive to employees to act in certain ways. There's a whole range of other non-monetary incentives, which might include different benefits packages, um, 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 dental, flexible work schedules, and that sort of thing, as well as employee recognition programs, um, providing employees with more empowerment and training and um, uh, making them more accountable for their decisions can be a non-monetary incentive to get employees to be motivated. So getting employees to be more involved in decision making in the organization can increase the empowerment or satisfaction of employees in the organization today. Sometimes organizations offer the ability to take time off work to do volunteerism or training as well, which is a form of a non-monetary incentive. So going forward, many organizations are becoming more creative at finding ways to motivate their employees. We've talked a little bit about some of the monetary incentives of stock option plans, which are becoming more and more common to tie bonuses to the level of performance in the organization, providing employees with benefits that allow them to better balance their work and private lives through flexible work arrangements and flexible scheduling, job sharing, and that sort of thing. So we'll see more and more of that. And really focusing on providing education and training. Many of the employees, particularly new or younger employees that are coming into the workforce today, are looking for the opportunities for advancement and personal growth through formal and informal education programs, cross-training within the organization as today. And certainly by having workers being treated more as team members and part of the overall organization as opposed to just workers is becoming more important in the workplace today. So, in fact, all of the companies, on the top 100 companies employers list really know the importance of treating employees properly, and they all have various programs that allow them to invest in their employees through these type of programs. So today's businesses really have to face the challenge of the increasing cost of absenteeism and turnover, and try to retain those good employees in our organizations as long as possible. So we've certainly come a long way from the days of scientific management, and so today organizations do provide a much wider variety of incentives to attract and retain our high quality employees. And we know that having a workforce that's committed, knowledgeable, creative, has employees who have high levels of skill, really provides a source of a sustainable competitive advantage in allowing us to compete in the very competitive business markets today. So whether you're a manager supervisor of people, important to think about some of the concepts learned in this chapter to increase the performance of our organization and retain our valued employees.